Hey everyone, it's Dr. Markan. This is the lecture on Chapter 14, the peripheral nervous system. Now, I'm not going to go over each and every slide. We're going to actually condense this chapter just a bit for time purposes, but know that I will be going over the major points that you will be tested on for the final. So the peripheral nervous system is functionally divided into sensory and motor divisions. Sensory inputs and motor inputs are subdivided into somatic and visceral, and then general and special. Now, nerves allow the central nervous system to receive information and then initiate action. So the first part of the peripheral nervous system that we're going to talk about is the most known, though not the most widely understood. We're going to talk about the general visceral motor part of the peripheral nervous system. This is also known as the autonomic nervous system, and we talked about the autonomic nervous system a lot during this course. So the ANS has two major divisions. We have the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So parasympathetic, we talked about being responsible for our rest and digest functions, and sympathetic nervous system being responsible for the fight or flight responses. So when we divide the peripheral nervous system into sensory or the afferent division or the motor efferent division, the autonomic nervous system falls under the motor or efferent division, okay? So ANS, we also call it the visceral motor division. It provides motor innervation of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And again, it can be further divided into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So within the peripheral nervous system, we can look at the different structures that make up the peripheral nervous system. So first we have our sensory receptors. These sensory receptors will pick up stimuli from inside or outside the body. We then have our nerves and ganglia, and we know that nerves are bundles of peripheral axons, whereas ganglia are clusters of peripheral neuronal cell bodies. Okay, and then we have our motor endings. These are the axon terminals of motor neurons that will innervate effectors, and usually these effectors are muscle fibers and glands. The peripheral sensory receptors are structures that pick up sensory stimuli and will initiate signals in the sensory axons. And we know that they will then go up the dorsal part of the spinal cord to go to the brain or to the CNS. So we have two main categories of sensory receptors. We have free nerve endings of sensory receptors. These monitor the general sensory information, and then we have complete receptor cells. These are specialized epithelial cells or small neurons that monitor most types of special sensory information. So these sensory receptors are classified according to these three things, based on location, the type of stimulus that are detected, and the structure. Okay, so first we're going to talk about classification according to location. We have what are called exteroreceptors. These are sensitive to stimuli arising from outside the body. So exta meaning outside. So these are located at or near body surfaces and include receptors for touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. And then we have interoreceptors. These receive a stimuli from internal viscera, so our inside organs, and they're located in the digestive tube, bladder, and lungs, and will monitor a variety of stimuli, including changes in chemical concentration, taste stimuli, stretching of tissues, as well as temperature. Another classification by location, we have our proprioceptors. These are located in skeletal muscles, tendons, joints, and ligaments, and they will monitor degree of stretch within these structures. They will then send inputs on body movements to the central nervous system. Okay, so those are the three classifications of our sensory receptors by location. We then have classification by the stimulus detected. So the first one we'll talk about, we have mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors respond to mechanical forces such as touch, pressure, stretch, vibration, and itch. We have specialized mechanoreceptors called baroreceptors that will monitor blood pressure and any changes in blood pressure. We then have thermoreceptors. Thermoreceptors, based on the name, respond to any temperature changes. We have chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors respond to chemicals in a solution. Photoreceptors respond to light, and these are located in the eye. And then we have nociceptors. These respond to harmful stimuli that result in pain. Okay, so those are the classification of our sensory receptors based on the stimulus that is detected. We then have classification according to structure. We have general sensory receptors. So general meaning a wide variety. So general receptors are widely distributed, and these are nerve endings of sensory neurons that will monitor touch, pressure, vibration, stretch, pain, temperature, and proprioception. And we have two groups of general sensory receptors. These are free nerve endings and encapsulated nerve endings. So here we can see 14.3, the structure of our proprioceptors within the muscle spindles and tendon organ. So virtually all proprioceptors are encapsulated nerve endings that monitor stretch in the locomotor organs. The organs that move. Proprioceptors include muscle spindles, tendon organs, and joint kinesthetic receptors. So here we see a muscle spindle. Muscle spindles measure the changing length of a muscle as the muscle contracts and is stretched back to its original shape. So structurally, each spindle contains several modified skeletal muscle fibers called intrafusal muscle fibers, and they are surrounded by a connective tissue capsule. We have annulospiral endings or primary sensory endings that twirl around the intrafusal muscle fibers and will innervate the muscle, the spindle center. So here we see those annulospiral endings. These are the primary sensory endings here surrounding or twirling around those intrafusal muscle fibers. And then we also have secondary sensory endings as well. These are called flower spray endings. Now, stretching will activate the primary and secondary endings that innervate the spindle, which will then cause them to fire off impulses that will travel up to the spinal cord and brain. The brain will then process it or integrate it at the integration center. The CNS then activates spinal motor neurons, and these are called alpha efferent neurons. That cause the extrafusal fibers. So alpha efferent motor fibers to the extrafusal muscle fibers here that cause these fibers to generate contractile force and resist further stretching. Now, this response can be initiated by a monosynaptic spinal reflex or controlled by the cerebellum. Cerebellum also regulates muscle tone, and muscle tone is defined as the steady force generated by non-contracting muscles to resist stretching. Okay, so this is a figure of a typical proprioceptor. So one thing, or a couple of things that I do want you to focus on with regards to this chapter are the different cranial nerves. So there are 12. There are many mnemonic devices to help you remember the cranial nerves. One I always use is on Old Olympic, Towering Tops, A Fin, and German Viewed Some Hops. But this is the old school mnemonic, taking into account that auditory is now part of the vestibulocochlear nerve. So I want you guys to definitely focus your energy on studying these cranial nerves, and then I'll go over another mnemonic to help you remember whether or not, each cranial nerve is purely sensory, purely motor, or both. So let's talk about the cranial nerves. Cranial nerves attach to the brain and pass through specific foramina of the skull. We talked about this in the very beginning when we talked about bones. Foramina, just a plural for foramen, which is a hole in the skull. Cranial nerves are numbered in Roman numerals from 1 to 12. So if you're not comfortable with your Roman numerals, make sure you become comfortable with Roman numerals, because that's how we old school label the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves 1 and 2, 1 being olfactory, 2 being optic, attached to the forebrain. All others attach to the brain stem. So the cranial nerves primarily serve head and neck structures. The vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10, is the only cranial nerve that extends into the abdomen. And you've seen this before. This is just a picture of the base of the skull, and it actually maps out all the cranial nerves for you. They go in order, so that should help when it comes to labeling the cranial nerves. So the first cranial nerve, or cranial nerve 1, is the olfactory nerve, and the olfactory nerve actually has 2 parts. There's the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract. Okay, so the olfactory bulb actually will have nerve endings that go through the ethmoid bone, or that criviform plate that we saw in the beginning of the semester. And then we'll pick up any stimuli coming in, any smells coming in from the nose. Okay, so there's cranial nerve 1. Here we have the optic nerve. They will come together and bifurcate and actually cross over at this structure called the optic chiasm. And then continue on the optic tract, sending stimuli to the occipital lobe, where we have our primary visual cortex. Okay, so cranial nerve 3 is basically at the top of the pons. So cranial nerve 3 is oculomotor nerve. This nerve is responsible for movements of our extraocular muscles, movement of our eye. Okay, and then going laterally, we have cranial nerve 4. This is the trochlear nerve. Trochlear nerve also helping out with some of the extraocular muscles of the eye, movement of the eye. And then continuing laterally, we have this large nerve that you guys are responsible for. This is the trigeminal nerve, here and here. And we talked about the 3 main divisions of the trigeminal nerve and how they have their innervations of the face. Okay, so from 5 we then go to the medial portion of the lower part of the pons. So we know that this is the pons. So from 5 we go to 6 here. So this more medial nerve, this is 6. This is known as the abducens nerve. Abducens nerve we'll talk about, also helps out with extraocular muscles of the eye. And then going laterally, we then have the facial nerve. Okay, facial nerve also responsible for innervation of the face, and I believe part of the tongue. Then we have the cranial nerve 8, which is a little bit lateral to the facial nerve. This is vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, it actually used to be 2 nerves in old school nomenclature, but now we kind of group it as 1 nerve responsible for both hearing and balance. So vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. And then going down, we then have the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9. When I think of glossopharyngeal nerve, I think of the way to elicit the glossopharyngeal nerve is to actually cause the gag reflex. The gag reflex is what's going to test out the cranial nerve 9. And just remember, it looks like if you spell it GAG, the 9 kind of looks like the A, so GAG would be part of cranial nerve 9. So then going down still lateral, we then have this very important nerve, cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. Okay, and we'll talk about the vagus nerve in just a little bit. And then final, second to last, we have this nerve going laterally still along the sides, but then you can see it's kind of going down the brain stem to the spinal cord. This is accessory nerve. It actually used to be called spinal accessory nerve, but now we just call it the accessory nerve. This is cranial nerve 11. And then finally, more medial, kind of next to the olives in the medulla, we can see cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. And again, a way to kind of test out and elicit the hypoglossal nerve is ask a patient to stick out their tongue. And here is just a cadaver section or cadaver brain where we can see the different cranial nerve, starting from cranial nerve 1, 2, then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then glossopharyngeal 9, vagus nerve 10, accessory nerve we see there 11, and then more medially the hypoglossal nerve. Okay. Now the next table kind of breaks it down as to whether or not the cranial nerve is sensory, motor, or both. A way to remember this, a mnemonic to remember is, some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter most. Or if you want to do a PG version, we can say big brains matter most. So let's write this out. Olfactory, some, so that's an S. And then optic, say, sensory. Some say, and then oculomotor is M. Marry, trochlear is M. Money. And then, but, for trigeminal, so both. My, motor for abducens. Brother, both for facial. Says, vestibulocochlear is sensory. Glossopharyngeal, both. So big, vagus is both. Brains, accessory is motor. Matter, and hypoglossal is M. So some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter most, or big brains matter most. Okay, so you can see that olfactory is purely sensory, optic, sensory, oculomotor, motor, makes sense, it's got motor in its name. Trochlear is motor, trigeminal nerve is both, because we know that it does provide sensory information from the face as well as motor innervation for the muscles of mastication to help you chew your food. Abducens, motor, again, one of those cranial nerves that helps with movement of the eye. Facial is both. Vestibulocochlear is purely sensory. Glossopharyngeal is both. Vagus nerve is both. Accessory is motor. Hypoglossal is motor. Okay. Oops. Guess I have to erase that. All right, moving on. So the first cranial nerve we'll talk about is the olfactory nerve, so cranial nerve 1. It is a special visceral sensory and provides us with our sense of smell. We have olfactory receptor cells located in olfactory epithelium of the nasal cavity. Again, these nerves pass through the cribriform plate, so the cribriform foramina of the ethmoid bone. And here we can see the olfactory nerve and then its little protrusions within the nasal cavity here. Okay, and then you can read about the different parts of the origin and the pathway of the of cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. Again, it's special somatory sensory, so purely sensory, and it helps us with our vision. It originates on the retina of the eye, will then pass through the optic canals of the sphenoid bone that we saw in the skull. It will then cross over at the optic chiasm and then continue along the optic tract towards the occipital lobe, where we have our primary visual cortex. So again, here we see the eyeballs, and each optic nerve will then cross over at the optic chiasm, and then the stimulus will travel along the optic tract, and then we have our stimulus going towards the occipital lobe, okay, towards the visual cortex. So it's actually pretty interesting if you guys also want to read the clinical applications. For example, optic nerve damage results in blindness, and usually due to damage to the visual pathway. And we as clinicians can actually look at different ways that the eyesight is damaged based on, any damage to any of these tracts. But luckily for you, you don't have to know that. But just know that, we have the optic nerve that will cross over at the optic chiasm and then send its stimuli to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3. So it provides motor function, innervates 4 of the extrinsic eye muscles. This is the superior rectus, the medial rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique. Unfortunately, we did not have enough time to go over the eyes and the different muscles that innervate the eyes and how the eyes move. I really wish we did. It's really cool. In other gross anatomy labs, I've actually had cow eyes, and we've also dissected out the cadaver eyes, and we can see the different muscles that kind of attach on the eyeball, and you can get a sense of how the eye will move when you move the different extraocular muscles. So anyways, the visceral motor function of the oculomotor nerve includes constriction of the pupil and also controls the shape of the lens. It passes through the superior orbital fissure. And here we see the table for the oculomotor nerve. We can see its innervations. It will go through the superior orbital fissure and then go to the back of the eyeball. Also will have innervations to the different extraocular muscles to help with movement of the eye. Okay, and make sure you guys do read this table on the oculomotor nerve, including clinical applications. The trochlear nerve, it has somatic motor functions. It will innervate the superior oblique muscle, another extrinsic eye muscle for movement. And it will pass ventrally and laterally around the midbrain and through the superior orbital fissure. So the other nerve that also innervates the eye muscles is the abducens nerve as well. We'll get into that, and I'll kind of give you a little mnemonic device to help you remember which nerves innervate the extrinsic eye muscles. So here we have the trochlear nerve, innervates superior oblique muscle, and then it will originate from the nuclei in the dorsal midbrain and pass ventrally around the midbrain through the superior orbital fissure. And then any damage to the trochlear nerve will result in double vision and reduce the ability to rotate the eye inferolaterally. So the next really important nerve that you guys definitely should know is the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve 5. This is the largest of the cranial nerves, has 3 divisions that we talked about. We have the ophthalmic division, or V1, we have the maxillary division, V2, and the mandibular division, V3. The cell bodies of the trigeminal nerve are located in the trigeminal ganglion, The mandibular division contains motor fibers that will innervate the muscles of mastication. Okay, and then we talked about the different holes in the skull that the trigeminal nerve, or the branches of the trigeminal nerve, passes through. V1 goes through the superior orbital fissure. V2 will go through the foramen rotundum. V3 will go through the foramen ovale, and then eventually out the skull via the mandibular foramen. And then we know that, you know, V1 will go through the superior orbital fissure and exit the skull, and the supraoptic foramen, sorry, not the supraoptic, the supraorbital foramen, and then V2 will exit the skull via the infraorbital foramen. So those two holes either above the orbit of the eye or below the orbit of the eye. And then V3 will go out the mandibular foramen, also known as the mental. Actually, we have the mandibular foramen as well as the mental foramen. Okay. And here we can see in this picture the different foramen that the branches of the trigeminal nerve will go through. So I would definitely take a look at that. So again, we have the three divisions, V1, which is ophthalmic, we have V2, which is maxillary, and V3, which is the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. So again, it is a mixed nerve that has both sensory and motor functions. The general somatic sensory nerve of the face, specifically for touch, temperature, and pain. And again, we know the mandibular division supplies motor innervation to the muscles of mastication. The abducens nerve, another one of those nerves that innervates one of the muscles, the extrinsic muscles of the eye. So it will innervate the lateral rectus muscle and helps to abduct the eye, and it passes through the superior orbital fissure. So a way to remember the cranial nerves that innervate the extrinsic muscles of the eye. So one way, I guess it starts. So I have LRA. So LRA stands for lateral rectus abducens, and then SOT. So superior orbital fissure, superior oblique muscle. Wow, more coffee, Dr. Marcon. Superior oblique muscle is innervated by the trochlear nerve. So LRA, SOT, the rest, cranial nerve 3. So, and then the rest is cranial nerve 3. Okay. 1, 2, 3. LRA, SOT, the rest, cranial nerve 3. So LRA, lateral rectus, is innervated by the abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve 6. SOT, superior oblique muscle, is innervated by the trochlear nerve. And then the rest of the extrinsic muscles of the eye are innervated by cranial nerve 3. So here is the table for the abducens nerve. Again, it has motor functions, innervating the lateral rectus muscle, and helps with abduction of the eye. Facial nerve, another important nerve. It has both sensory and motor functions. The sensory function provides special visceral sensory from the taste buds on the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Okay. And then we have somatic motor functions. We have 5 branches that innervate the facial muscles. Unfortunately for you, you don't need to know all 5 of the facial muscles, or 5 branches that innervate the facial muscles. The visceral motor function includes innervation of our lacrimal glands, our submandibular and sublingual salivary glands, okay? So helps with sort of our salivary gland secretion of saliva. innervation of lacrimal glands, mandibular sublingual pathway, enter the temporal bone through the internal acoustic meatus. Okay, and then here is the facial nerve. Interestingly enough, we know that it does provide some motor innervation to the face. When we have, for example, when we have any lesions or any disease that might affect the facial nerve, we have a condition known as Bell's palsy. And with Bell's palsy, you'll see drooping of one side of the face, and this is usually due to damage or something going on with the branch of the facial nerve. Okay, and again, you don't need to know the 5 divisions of the facial nerve, the motor branches, but if you did need to know, you could actually just place your hand on the side of your face and it will show you the different branches of the motor divisions of the facial nerve, their names and where they go, which is kind of cool. But unfortunately, we do not have time for that. Just know that facial nerve is both sensory and motor, and sort of some of the things that the facial nerve does. Vestibulocochlear nerve. Again, this is sort of a 2 nerves in 1 kind of deal, where you have the this nerve is responsible for hearing and equilibrium. So again, vestibulocochlear is purely sensory. The vestibular branch, it is special somatic sensory and deals with equilibrium, whereas the cochlear branch is responsible for hearing. The pathway of the vestibulocochlear nerve is from the inner ear cavity, and fibers will then pass through the internal acoustic meatus. Okay, and we can see its innervations into that inner ear. So because this nerve kind of is a 2 nerves in 1, if we have any lesions in the cochlear nerve or cochlear receptors, this usually results in central or nerve deafness. Whereas if we have damage to the vestibular division of this nerve, you could have dizziness, rapid involuntary eye movements, loss of balance, nausea, and vomiting. Glossopharyngeal nerve. So glossopharyngeal nerve does have some sensory function from taste buds on the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So we had facial nerve that did the anterior 2/3, whereas glossopharyngeal innervates the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So again, gives general visceral sensory to posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the pharyngeal mucosa, chemoreceptors in the carotid body, as well as baroreceptors of the carotid sinus. We also have a motor function, helps elevate the pharynx during swallowing, can innervate the parotid salivary glands, and we have fibers that pass through the jugular foramen. And here we can see the different branches of the glossopharyngeal nerve innervating the parotid gland as well as the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Vagus nerve, very important nerve. So the vagus nerve has sensory functions, gives general visceral sensory, or gets general visceral sensory from the thoracic and abdominal viscera, so all the organs in the thorax and abdomen, whatever it innervates, as well as taste buds on the epiglottis. Motor functions, so it gives motor innervation to skeletal muscles of the pharynx and the larynx. So the vagus nerve is important for parasympathetic innervation to the heart, the lungs, as well as abdominal viscera, okay? So it has effectors in those organs. The pathway, it will exert through the jugular foramen, and then you can see all the organs that the vagus nerve will innervate. So if we know that parasympathetic is rest and digest, it will stimulate those types of effects on all these organs. Accessory nerve, also known as the spinal accessory nerve, has somatic motor function, will innervate the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscles. When we want a patient to, we want to check whether or not they have an intact spinal accessory or accessory nerve, we ask the patient to kind of shrug their shoulders. So we know that it does provide motor innervation to those muscles. It's formed from the ventral rootlets of C1 through C5, do not arise from the brainstem. We saw kind of where it was on the back of, not really the brainstem, but kind of along those roots. So spinal rootlets merge to form this nerve, pass into the skull through the foramen magnum, will exit the skull through the jugular foramen. So we kind of can see the rootlets emerging from the spinal cord, okay, not the brainstem. So injury to the accessory nerves causes the head to turn toward the side of the injury as a result of paralysis of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. The patient will have problems with shrugging the shoulders, and that would be due to lesions or damage to the accessory nerve. The last cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve. Cranial nerve 12 has somatic motor functions, will innervate the tongue muscles. Again, when we want to check to see whether or not the cranial nerve 12 or hypoglossal nerve is still working, we ask a patient to stick out their tongue. The hypoglossal nerve will exit the skull through the hypoglossal canal. Okay, so we can see here the functions of the hypoglossal nerve, and then damage to the hypoglossal nerve causes difficulties in speech as well as swallowing. If this nerve was impaired, the person could not protrude the tongue. If only one side is affected, the tongue will deviate toward the affected side. And then eventually that paralyzed side begins to atrophy. So I'm going to stop the lecture video here for part 1 of the cranial nerves. Part 2 will kind of have some general characteristics, or we'll talk about the rest of the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about the nerve plexuses, just, very briefly. We're not going to get into too much detail, but definitely focus a lot of your studying on the cranial nerves. Okay.